Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast,
a podcast of Wheaton College.
That was coming directly out of this idea of, I don't feel like a writer, but I'm sitting here writing, so maybe I am a writer. And I was having to learn how to just keep writing, even though I didn't feel like a writer. When you've never published a book, it's kind of weird to say, I'm a writer, actually.
Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast. I'm Jim Beitler, the director of the Wade Center, and I'm here with my co-host and our podcast producer, Aaron Hill. Today we are delighted to be joined by Jonathan Rodgers. Jonathan is an author, creative writing teacher, and podcaster. He's written the Wilderking Trilogy, The Charlatan's Boy, and a series of nonfiction books. There's a book on St. Patrick, I think, The Terrible Speed of Mercy, a spiritual biography of Flannery O'Connor, and probably most relevant for our listeners, The World According to Narnia. He has a PhD in 17th century English literature from Vanderbilt. And I think many of our listeners may know Jonathan from his podcast, The Habit, where he talks to writers about writing. And if not, I'd encourage you to check that out. But today we're going to be mostly talking about his Wilderking Trilogy, The Bark of the Bog Owl, The Secret of the Swamp King, and The Way of the Wilderking. The 20th anniversary edition of that series has just been published by Rabbit Room Press. Jonathan, welcome to the Wade Podcast.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I love what y'all do, and I really appreciate you letting me talk to you for a little while.
Well, it's great to have you on. I was wondering if you'd begin by just telling our listeners a bit about the Wilderking Trilogy. Give us a little bit of an introduction to it. It's a retelling of the story of King David, but it's in some ways much more than that. Yeah.
Yeah, I first conceived of the story. I've told the story many times, but I was on a trip to Florida in which one friend gave me a series of tapes of a Eugene Peterson sermon series that became his Leap Over a Wall book about the life of David, and sort of really got me thinking about some of the narrative possibilities in that book. And at the same time, the same week, I went canoeing down a swampy river, and it sort of shook something loose in me. Those two things together, thinking about the narrative possibilities. There's both in the David story. There's the giant killing story. There is a sort of a quest story where Saul sends him out to kill a large number of Philistines, sending him on a possible quest, which turns out not to be impossible. Mm-hmm. And then there's this sort of Robin Hood or outlaw story within the David story. And most of it taking place in a wilderness setting. And so, again, as I listened to those sermons from Eugene Peterson, plus I was in this swampy, alligatory, snaky, turtley world, something just sort of shook loose, and I wanted to mash all those things together and sort of reimagine some of the themes of the David story in the kind of wild places that I was most interested in and most familiar with. So I sometimes say that the Wilderking stories are fantasy adventure told in an American accent, and all the places, all the critters in those books are actually. They live in the American South, and I was just always interested in that, and so that's kind of where those things got mashed up.
Jonathan, I was going to ask you. I noticed in the opening of the book that it says you were born in Warner Robins, Georgia. I know exactly where that is because that's where my wife was born, and I actually my in-laws still live in Warner Robins.
Is that right? And
I was noticing as I was reading through this story,
really,
that. It felt like it reminded me of being a middle school boy climbing trees in Georgia because I grew up in Augusta, Georgia.
Okay.
And so I was wondering if there was any of your own childhood growing up in the South. You said with an American accent, but it definitely feels like a Southern accent. There's even like words like flibberty gibbet and stuff in there that I've only ever heard people say in the South. So how much of this was inspired by your sort of background growing up, particularly in the South?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it. I mean, there's that whole tribe of swamp people, the Fiji folks, are kind of, I knew a guy named Jake who was basically Dobro Turtlebane. He was just a wild man who lived so far out in the country. He hunted wild hogs, and his dog got eaten by an alligator, and all kinds of things happened that that really I thought, if I ever write a book, I want Jake to be in that book. And so Jake became Dobro, and then Dobro became a whole tribe of people. And so, yeah, that kind of, again, I don't know how, I don't always know what's specifically Southern and what's not, because I've only lived in the South, right? But I know there were some of the people I got mixed up with growing up seemed, they were very, let's just say, committed to I was always interested in this idea of, I was always sort of bookish, and yet I was around these people who were very committed to physical courage. They were always wanting to fight somebody, and they were always out in the woods doing something involving animals. And that was always fascinating to me, that somehow you could live in this world where I might be living this sort of comfortable suburban life, but my neighbors maybe weren't. They were doing something else. And that was always interesting to me. And so, I mean, even you mentioned, Aaron, that your wife's from the same place I'm from. Knowing that that's a relatively civilized place, right? There was a couple of McDonald's, and we had microwave ovens and things like that. And yet, not very far away, there were alligators, and there were some crazy things happening in the woods. And that was always interesting to me. Again, I don't know that that's Southern necessarily. The alligator part, I guess, is Southern. They don't get a lot of alligators, in Chicago. But so there's, that's to me, that's kind of a lot of what's driving this story is this rubbing up against the civilized world, rubbing up against a world that's a lot less civilized, whether that's the wilderness itself or kind of the wild people, the Fiji folks that Aidan gets mixed up with in this book, or in these books.
I'd like to come back to that later in the conversation, but I had another question about the your influences. And, this is the Wade Center podcast, so we talk about Lewis and Tolkien. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ways in which they've influenced your writing or not. What did you learn by reading those authors? You've written this book, The World According to Narnia, so feel free to talk about that too.
Yeah, I think those writers gave me a vision for what it might look like to write about the themes of the faith, sort of embody the gospel in ways that aren't necessarily allegory or, I mean, the truth is there's a lot of retelling of the David story, especially in the Bog Owl, especially in book 1. And yet, as I got deeper into the process of writing those books, I got less and less interested in a direct retelling. I got more interested in what are the ideas around, for instance, in the case of David's life, he found out he was going to be king long before he was ever king. And then he had to figure out what he's going to do with himself in those intervening years. How is he going to be loyal? If he's an anointed king someday, how does he stay loyal to the king who's king now? How does he deal with the fact that the adults in his life who've taught him certain truths don't seem to be living out those truths themselves? And I guess from reading Tolkien and Lewis, I did learn something about how you talk about these things, how you talk about biblical ideas or biblical principles or stories for that matter, without slavishly following that story directly. And the funny thing is, when I started writing the Bog Owl, I was sort of slavishly following, and as I through the process, I'd never written a novel before I wrote that, and in the process, I kind of got a little freedom, from the story. And again, I think a lot of that, you can see that same handling of big important ideas in ways that are embodied in story, embodied in everything from setting to character to not being put in the form of speeches, but rather in action, in dramatic form, to borrow Flannery O'Connor's term.
Yeah. Lewis famously said that fantasy was a vehicle to steal past watchful dragons. And by that, he meant he used his stories to convey Christian truths in ways that avoided the kind of stale religiosity of his day, or just the outright distrust of religion. Tolkien was more concerned with the details of world building and developing a good story. And I can see both of those things working in your books. Do you find yourself resonating with one of those approaches more than the other? The kind of, on the one hand, trying to convey Christian truths through narrative. On the other hand, just building a world through your writing.
as I think back on those, the Wilderking books, I really can see that I relied on both of those approaches. Although I will say in books 2 and 3, it's a little more Tolkienish, in relying on the world to tell the story. A reader might miss the fact that this story is repurposing some of the David story in books 2 and 3. You can't miss it in book 1.
Right.
If you were paying attention in Sunday school at all. There are things that you just can't miss.
There is a giant, after all.
There is a giant. Yeah. And it's funny, when I went back and found the very first pages I wrote in the Bark of the Bog Owl, and I always tell writers, start where you can start. You don't have to start at the beginning, just wherever you can start there. And I started in the encounter between Aiden and the giant, and found that in the original, the first day I sat down to write, I hadn't even changed the names. Aiden was named David, and the giant was named Giant. And I was like, no, I'm going to change these later. So that's how slavishly I was following the original when I first started.
Well, actually, and you actually start with a letter from the David character, Aiden, to the king. And I thought that was a great beginning for a character who is, like David, a shepherd, a warrior, but also a writer. And this is not Aiden's first letter to the king. This is like his 16th letter to the king, unanswered. Which tells you something both about the king and about Aiden. What was it like to write about a character who was also a writer? I imagine that came with some joys and maybe some challenges as well.
Yeah. I don't know. Remember, I wrote these things 20 years ago, or I guess 21 years ago, or 22 years ago, because this is the 20th anniversary that it's coming out. So I'm trying to remember. I really loved, there's about 4 letters punctuating book 1. And I really enjoyed writing those and sort of embodying that voice of a young person who's intelligent, but also pretty naive. and having a sense of self that's not quite that's a little a little bit of self-deception in there, and yet I mean for a 12-year-old boy to expect to hear back from the king is kind of that, to me, that's a funny idea.
I noticed there were a lot of songs throughout the not a lot, but more songs than you typically see in a novel. Was that something that you were feeling like you needed to sort of pay homage to David as a psalmist character, or was that a Tolkien-inspired thing? Was it all of the above?
I just like to write little songs, little songs and poems. And it had not occurred to me that would be a very appropriate for a David character to write songs until you just said it right there, Aaron. So
really,
you should be a literary critic, Aaron. Oh yeah, I just like it.
Okay.
And in book 2 once you get into book 2 and 3, it's like even more songs. And I had a friend recently tell me, when I get to the songs and books, I skip them, but he said he read mine, which I appreciated.
Well, you can't skip the songs with Tolkien either. I mean, he's got some great songs in there.
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes when I go back and I reread the Lord of the Rings, I do skip the songs sometimes.
I tend to skip them when I read them. Although when you listen to them in an audiobook and there's somebody singing them, I love to hear them sung.
Yeah,
That's right.
Very different story. I was going to ask you, Jonathan. There's a section in one of the chapters. It's right when Beitler, the prophet, the sort of Samuel figure, is anointing. Places his hand on Aiden. And Aiden has this question where he says, like, well, what if I don't feel like the Wilderking? What if I don't feel like a king? And Beitler has this response where he says, well, I don't really feel like a prophet either. It's just a question of, whether I am and whether, God says that I am. So I really like that section. I thought that was really good. I thought that was particularly relevant for like young adults. Growing up, you struggle with, like you said, the consistency between what older people are doing, what they say and what they do, but then also this sense of like, well, what does it feel like to be a fill in the blank? And it reminded me of the section in Paralandra where the Ransom character is having this whole internal dialogue in his mind. He's kind of talking to God, but he's also talking to himself, and he's wrestling with this task of actually physically fighting the unman character. And I thought that was a really good job of sort of almost kind of digging into like Baynard's own mental processes, and then Aiden's as well, kind of putting you behind the veil of that as a writer. So I just wanted to compliment you on it. I thought it was a really good section. It kind of reminded me of the way that Lewis approaches stories more so than Tolkien, because with Tolkien, everything's sort of like out in the open. It doesn't happen unless somebody actually talks about it. Whereas with Lewis, there's a lot more sort of internal mind perspective.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah, I was really, again, this was 20 years ago I was writing this, and was very much trying to sort out my own calling at the time. I'd quit a job with a technology company, and I'd been an academic before that, and it was just all just sort of sorting things out all the way around. And I think it's again, in terms of my work as a writer, that was coming directly out of this idea of I don't feel like a writer, but I'm sitting here writing, so maybe I am a writer, and I know I have gifts in that direction, and so that's all. I was having to learn how to just keep writing, even though I didn't feel like a writer, or I was embarrassed to say. If somebody says, "What do you do?" It was kind of, when you've never published a book, it's kind of weird to say, "I'm a writer." Actually, at our house we have something we call putting on the tennis skirt, and what that means is my wife had played tennis for years, but she never bought a tennis skirt, because to buy a tennis skirt would be somehow declaring herself to be a tennis player, and she wasn't sure it would be cool. She's always asking, am I good enough tennis player? Do I only play once a week? How many times a week do you have to play to be a tennis player? To declare yourself a tennis player by getting a tennis skirt. So I just went and got her a tennis skirt and said, "Here, wear this. You're a tennis player." And so we, around our house, we talk about putting on the tennis skirt, just kind of saying, I don't know how you feel about things, but here's who you are, and so do this.
Yeah, kind of living into the identity.
Yeah.
Kind of picking up on that point, the theme of vocation just runs throughout this book. I mean, it's the title, right? The bark of the Bog Owl is a calling, right?
Yeah,
it's Aiden's calling. And then Bayard, the truth speaker, this prophet, this one who in some ways gives Aiden his vocation, has some wise lines to him. One of them is, live the life that unfolds before you. And another one is, love goodness more than you love evil, or more than you fear evil, I should say. I guess with regard to vocation, both of these ideas struck me as very different from what I sometimes hear my students saying about vocation. And to be quite honest, what I felt about vocation throughout my life, and that is the notion that I've got to figure out exactly what God wants me to do with my life. And oftentimes that's framed in terms of career. Like, what does God want me to do in terms of my job? But the message, live the life that unfolds before you and love goodness, is also a kind of vocational calling. And I think there's wisdom there. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Why is that a helpful way to think about one's calling?
Well, I mean, a big part of it is we're not very good at looking down the corridors of time and seeing what, I mean, I remember, again, this is writing advice, but writing advice always turns out to be life advice too. And
so true.
Anne Lamott talks about the idea, and she didn't originate this, but I don't remember where she got it, that writing a book is like driving at night by your headlights, and you can't see beyond the next curve. Yeah. But when you get to the next curve, that's going to be illuminated too. And you can't, again, I was at a point in my life when I was writing that book that I was experiencing that. I mean, I had made plans for what my future might look like, and then things unfolded in a different way, and I had to learn how to live into what was there. I'm having to learn that right now too, 20 years later, that I don't feel very good at seeing the big picture of what God has for me, but I do know some things I need to do today and tomorrow and the day after that, and when I get around the next curve, the headlights will light up the next curve too. But I don't know how else you live a life, really. I mean, except just, I know you can certainly get a 401k. That's one thing you can do, but sometimes I'll watch those commercials of where the couple that has that's 5 years older than me has planned well, and now they're watching going on a whale watching tour. And they're seeing the whale come out of the water, and they look so happy, and they've got their nice sweaters. And I think, I should have planned better. And because I'm 55, I still haven't seen a whale. And but you're kind of, my vocation apparently does not involve being able to go on a nice whale watching trip. So
No, but I think your point is actually such a comfort, right? Yeah, you in some ways you can only see just a little bit ahead. That's kind of what we're given at each stage. At least that seems to be the case.
And that's enough.
Just around the corner, to use your metaphor. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a line you have also in the book where Baynard is talking to Aiden, and he's trying to say that he was lucky to have killed the panther. And I really like this line. I highlighted it. He says, "You wrong the providence that preserves you when you credit luck for your deliverance." So there's this element you introduce in the book of providence versus luck. What sort of, it's almost, it's very biblical. It's like God's laid out a path for you. You may not know what that path is, but it does exist. And when we credit luck or we credit somebody else for something that God has done in our lives, we're discrediting, we're wronging, we're doing something to harm the Creator when we're denying that. I wonder if you had any more thoughts on that. I just thought that was a neat little line that was in there in terms of providence. It's definitely something that's a huge theme in David's life. This guy shows up one day and says, "You're going to be the next king of Israel." And then the next, years of his life is spent trying to figure out, and I'm sure there are moments when it felt like everything had gone horribly wrong. And I'm sure people have been there before. So, yeah, did you have any thoughts about that as far as providence? Where did that line come from, or that idea, that concept?
Bayard's an interesting figure because he comes along and tells everybody, he's the quotable one, but the real work of fiction is not having the quotable guy come out and say quotable stuff. It's sort of you're trying to. I was trying to earn the right to have somebody come out and say quotable stuff.
Gotcha.
And I think that's, again, you were talking about, I think I learned that from Lewis. Jim, you were saying earlier what I learned from Lewis. I think that's one of the things to earn the right. There are some great quotable moments in the Narnia books. But it's remarkable in fiction how little of it is quotable. And a fiction, I don't believe in fiction that's too quotable. Because you're trying to create this action, this drama that it makes sense for a guy like Bayard to come out and say wise things.
I think Lewis said something similar actually about Paradise Lost, that it's not full of quotable lines, and part of that is because it's supposed to be this immersive thing. And a quotable line would take you out of that. Lewis and actually Tolkien was the one who kind of came up with this metaphor, I think. He was talking about the relationship between fantasy, fairy stories, and children. I want to ask a question about audience. So I can imagine that these books are often referred to as children's books, but Tolkien and Lewis would not probably have liked that label, kind of labeling one's works children's books. Tolkien said that there was no essential connection between fairy stories and children's literature. He wrote that fairy stories have in the modern lettered world been relegated to the nursery as shabby or old-fashioned furniture is relegated to the playroom, primarily because the adults do not want it and do not mind if it is misused. It is not the choice of the children which decides this. And so for him, there's no essential connection, right, between fairy stories and children's literature. Fairy stories are for adults too. I wonder about the reception to your work, your audience, how you think about these books in terms of audience. Who are you writing for?
Well, I guess when you were asking how Lewis influenced, Lewis and Tolkien influenced, that would have been that should have been my first answer, is this idea that any books that's worth reading when you're a child is worth reading when you're an adult. I would say I'm writing for families. It's important to me that these stories be something that the younger members of the family could enjoy, but that the parents would enjoy reading to them. I didn't spend any time trying to think what would be funny to a 10-year-old. It was just what's funny.
Right.
And so I cracked myself up. I mean, when I read these books, I think they're really funny. I mean, because I was putting in jokes I thought were funny, and so therefore, it's embarrassing how funny I think these stories are.
Well, sometimes the mark of good writing is, does it please you, right? Does it please the author?
Absolutely.
That's a really important test.
I don't know any other way to assess whether something's good or not, other than do I enjoy it? And I think it'd be some sort of false modesty for a writer not to say they enjoy the heck out of their own prose. Either that or they shouldn't be doing it. I mean, if it's not false modesty, then if it's actual, they actually don't enjoy what they're writing, they shouldn't be doing it.
That's right. So a few questions about timing and context. You were writing this book shortly after 9/11. This was early 2000s, right?
Yeah. I wrote The Bog Owl in 2002. Yeah.
Okay. I'm wondering, what did the context of the time shape this book at all? And how does the current context? Let me rephrase that. Why re-release the book now? Essentially, why does this book matter now? So context then, context now.
Yeah, I think in 2002 when I was writing this story, I was certainly interested in the idea of courage. What it means to be courageous in the midst of fearful situations, and there certainly was a lot of fear. The seesaw had just tipped from this sort of unreasonable optimism in American culture to a pessimism that I remember thinking we were just going to forever, in the 90s, thinking stock market was going to always go up and we were always going to be, from triumph to triumph, and
right.
And then a pessimism that started to take hold, that it seemed important to me to talk about. Again, some of this is we don't know what the future holds, therefore tend to your business. Live whatever unfolds in front of you, and God is good, and it's not obvious how things are going to work out, but you live the life that unfolds before you. I think that's as relevant as ever. I mean, it's more relevant now, it seems to me, and there's a certain amount of courage required. I mean, the sense of pessimism and the sense that we don't have as a culture a good future to look forward to. I've never seen anything like it than compared to what we've got going right now, and so that idea of courage in the face of uncertainty, of knowing that I don't know what's around the corner, but I know that God is good. I think that's what we need a lot of now. I think maybe in 20 years, my own thinking about, there is as I reread these stories, there is a sort of a confidence that God is on our side, so to speak, that I think could be misused and maybe has been misused. And if I were writing this story again, I might not be. There's a little bit of us and them going on in this story that could be misused and misunderstood. And
I'd actually like to ask you about that. In some ways you're telling the story of David and the people of God, and as you said earlier, you describe your fiction as fantasy adventure told with an American accent, right? So it seems to me that bringing those two things together, the story of David with, in some ways, the American story, could potentially come with some risks.
Yeah.
Specifically in terms of like conflating the two. Yeah. In ways that implicitly suggest that that Americans are the people of God.
Yeah.
So how do you navigate those challenges? What does that look like for you?
I think here's how I navigate it. First, the people talk like Americans. The setting the settings are American, but these the Cornwalters aren't American people. I think the gist of it is empire and power hunger versus a freedom that opposes empire, for lack of a better word. I mean, that's kind of what's going on in all three of these stories, is that there's this sort of this empire that is half Roman, half Assyrian. The Persians are this. They're kind of all the kinds of empire that threatens, that kind of stands for the city of man versus the city of God. And I think if I were writing the story again, I would do a little more a little more thinking on the city of God and the city of man. Augustine's idea, and maybe make it a little clearer that that's what we're talking about. but the Perthens' commercial and military power on the one hand versus the sort of plucky people who are just again, I've used the word tending to their business. I think of that as the Cornwalder way of life, is sort of tending to your own business. And the truth is, Jim, you said, are we somehow conflating the biblical idea of God's chosen people with Americanism? There are ways of thinking, and there are people who would say that empire has some similarities to America's role in the world, right? I mean, I think we as Americans have some imperial tendencies that we need to keep in check.
Right. And
we want to be the Cornwalders and not the Perthens.
Right.
And I guess that's how I handle that. But you have hit on something that is a little bit of a concern for me 20 years on.
And so as we're reading it, to be mindful of, as an American reader myself, to be mindful of who I'm identifying myself with in the story, and to use the story to think through those issues, and in that way, I think that's a possible way of reading it in light of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I also have to say I love the illustrations.
Oh, aren't they
change
great?
Subjects a little bit.
Yeah.
And these are new illustrations, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
By Joe Hawks, and there's a map in the front by Abe Goolsby.
Abe made the map. Actually, that map is from. It originally appeared in the Charlatan's Boy, and so Abe Goolsby, made that map.
And here again, I was thinking back to Lewis. If you come to the Wade Center, one of the things you can see the original map of Narnia that was drawn by the English illustrator Pauline Baines. She did all of the Narnia illustrations, and of course they're so great, and they lodge in your mind. I mean, I can still see Polly and Diggory flying on Fledge, or at the end of the last battle, you can see the characters going through the wooden doorway with Aslan at the doorway in your mind's eye. So I'm sure your readers are going to love these new illustrations. Could you talk a little bit about that collaboration with Joe, and what you're hoping your readers will take away from the new illustrations?
Yeah. So Joe was already a Wilderking reader before he got this assignment, and so when Pete Peterson of the Rabbit Room Press called him, he was just really thrilled to be able to do it. And his attention to the way he portrays the Fiji folks, for instance, is like he got it so thoroughly. They're funny, and they're a little threatening, and they're they're alarming looking, but they've got so much spirit. I was just so thrilled when I saw what he had done, and some of the ones he threw away were fantastic. I mean, he sketched out some. I thought, oh, that's brilliant, but we could only do 10, and so But I will say, in book 2, he did his 10 illustrations, and then he turned them in. They were fantastic. We loved them, and then he said, oh, I thought I'd show you this one other one that I was thinking about doing, and he sent it to me. I said, that's the best thing. That's the best one of all the ones that you've done, and if you will let us do 11 instead of 10, I will name some Fichis after your children. And so, in book 2, there's a Fiji sing where people, Dobro singing a sad song, and the Fiji folks are crying, and it is just so perfect. I paid for that with Fiji names, and so I didn't realize Joe had 4. I didn't realize Joe had 4 kids, so I had to dig around to find 4 Fijis to change their names. So,
they'll love seeing their names in the book. That'd be great. I also like, if you look at the back cover, the stories take place in a swampland, and there's a fine print at the bottom of the book. It says, if book does not smell faintly of swamp, soak in tepid water for 3 to 4 months for dramatic results. May have adverse effect on reading experience. I thought that was great. So
the Rabbit Room Press is always very open-minded about what kind of things they're going to put on title pages or copyright pages and that kind of thing. And so there's all these Easter eggs in the Rabbit Room books. So that was Pete Peterson's doing.
Aaron, do you have any other questions for Jonathan?
No, I think we covered them. I just wanted to thank you just for, I had never actually heard of Wilderking Trilogy or the series, and so I'm excited to finish the rest of the series and look at those. Excellent. And then I'm actually really interested in your biography of Flannery O'Connor. Yeah. So
I'm proud of that book. Yeah. That's a good one. Hey, can we return to your, the question you asked about conflating the Americans with the chosen people. I just want to return to this idea. I mean, I alluded to it, but I want to get back to it. The idea of the city of God and the city of man. Of course, we all are we find ourselves having to be both simultaneously. We're residents of the city of God and residents of the city of man. Our citizenship is in the city of God, and yet we find ourselves in living among the city of man. And I think. Thank you for asking me that question, because it wasn't until you asked it specifically that I know how to talk about. I think I'm figuring out how to talk about this, because I think it's so important that we always ask. It's always tempting to live my life and find my value in the ways that the city of man calls on me to find my value, which is always making myself, exalting myself a little bit more, in Paradise Lost, here's something quotable, where Satan says it's better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven, which is insanity. Right. It is. And yet that is what the city of man.
That's what we do on a day-to-day basis.
On a day-to-day basis. That's right. And it's like since this is the Wade Center podcast, we'll put it in terms of The Magician's Nephew, where the Jada says, "I destroyed the world, but at least I'm the queen of this destroyed world," and that's just another way of saying it's better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. And so the Cornwalders, who frankly maybe don't fully understand their position, probably do think of themselves as, or maybe whether they do or don't, they could. You can imagine them think of themselves as sort of the chosen people. But the question is always, for all of us, all the time, which of these cities am I choosing to be a citizen of at any time? And so, again, if I were writing it this year instead of 2002, I may have approached that a little bit differently. But I hope this is a book that lets us think through: what's the value of choosing to live in the city of God instead of the city.
And the payoff for that is eternity. I mean, of choosing rightly in that respect. Back to The Magician's Nephew, Aslan asked Diggory to go get this fruit from the garden, and Jadis the witch takes the fruit, eats the fruit, and Diggory desperately wants to have the fruit to heal his mom, but he takes the fruit back to Aslan, and ultimately he gets. Not only the reward, essentially, of Narnia, but he gets his mother's health back too, which is amazing. So, Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for that. Thank you for that conversation. Just a pleasure to have you on, and hope to talk to you again, either on the Wade podcast or the Habit podcast or elsewhere. So, thank you. All right,
sounds good. Let's do it.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.